Hey everyone, we are in the last week of our series on comparison called The Thief of Everything. And we've been talking about all the ways that we can get caught up in this idea of comparison and what we can do to break free from it. And as we kick off today, I want you to think about a question for just a second. And the question is this, is who is somebody that you look up to right now? Who's somebody that you look up to right now? Or maybe who's somebody that you used to look up to when you were a little bit younger? Maybe it's an athlete, an actor, a musician, a dancer, a designer, a YouTuber, a writer, comedian, podcaster, an inventor. The list can go on and on for days. But here's the thing, is who is someone that you admire for what they do? You watch them doing what they do best and you think, wow, that is awesome. And I would love to be doing that same thing one day. Now, for me, I think back to when I was in middle school and growing up in a small rural town in Indiana. We didn't have a football team at our school at the time that I went there. And so we had a basketball team though. And that was like the biggest thing in the world. If you were on the basketball team, you were idolized, you were considered really significant. You could get away with a lot of things. And so immediately for many of us, we decided, hey, we're going to play basketball because we want to be, those people. And so we played for years, but we would always go to our varsity games on Fridays and Saturday nights. And what would happen is we would, begin to kind of idolize or admire certain individuals on our team. And for me as a middle schooler, one of the individuals that I really looked up to, his name was Scott. And Scott was the starting point guard on our varsity basketball team for several years. And the reason that I looked up to Scott is because he was about, the height that I knew I was going to be. He played the position that I wanted to play. Like there were just a lot of things going for him on the court. He was a great athlete. And it didn't hurt that he had what many of us believed as middle school boys was the hottest girl in school as his girlfriend. And so all of this was going on. And so it became a thing where basically a lot of us looked up to Scott and a lot of us kind of idolized him and thought he's somebody that we really admire, that he does something that we one day hope to be able to do. But here's the thing, is as I got to know Scott a little bit because we were a small school and so we did get to spend time sometimes with the varsity players, what I realized is that basically Scott served as a reminder of everything that I wasn't, because he was a little bit taller. He was a little bit more skilled on the basketball court. He was a little bit better student. He had a much better looking girlfriend, all of these things. And see, when we idolize somebody so much, the problem is that we want to be just like them. And the problem is that we start to realize that our lives aren't the same, not even a little bit. In other words, we can't compare with them. And so in this series, we've been talking a lot about comparing ourselves with other people. And oftentimes it's with people that we look up to. We compare ourselves to them. And that's what I was doing with Scott. Now, let me clearly state, there's nothing wrong with looking up to somebody, with being inspired by them or hoping to be like them one day. This is why we put you with incredible small group leaders each week, because it's great to have people that you can look up to, that can motivate you to make positive changes, to live more full lives, and to draw closer to God. That's an incredible gift. We want you to have people to look up to. But the reality is this, is that the problem comes when comparison shows up. The problem comes when comparison shows up. When we make the switch from looking up to them to thinking that in order for us to be enough, we have to achieve what they've achieved, or we have to do what they've done, or we have to become like they are. And the reality is that kind of comparison will always leave us feeling like we're not enough. You see, what happens is the more we look at them, the worse we feel about us. The more we look at them, the worse we feel about us. Now that's what happened with Scott and me. And that's why I'm really disappointed to say that, the time that I did spend with him, I found myself comparing my life to his. And every day you see people that you can look up to. Maybe it's upperclassmen, older siblings, the girl on your team that's a little bit better than you, or the guy that's in your class that got a better test score than you did. Even peers and friends can fit into that category. And that's fine, because it's okay to look at other people and to say, wow, I'm really happy about the way things are going for you. And I want to one day be like that. And to be happy about the way things are going for them. But as soon as you compare a part of your life to theirs, you suddenly feel like you're not enough. As soon as you compare a part of your life to theirs, you suddenly start to feel like, I'm not enough. You say things like, well, I'm not cool enough, smart enough, attractive enough, talented enough, rich enough, funny enough, popular enough, or good enough. And we're so caught up with this idea of comparison that it changes the way we see ourselves. And it's not a change for the good. It becomes the thief of self-esteem, self-worth, and confidence. Let me say that again. It becomes the thief of self-esteem, self-worth, and confidence. And what's worse is that it doesn't end. And as soon as we start to feel like, well, maybe I'm smart enough, we look around and we realize, well, I may be smart enough, but I'm not popular enough. Or as soon as we're popular enough, we look around and we start to think, well, I'm not attractive enough. And somehow we find ourselves going in this cycle and it will never be enough. And as you think about that, that sounds exhausting, doesn't it? Because it's the thief of everything. And it's not how you and I are meant to be living our lives. There's got to be a better way. And the question is how do we break free from this cycle of feeling like we're never enough? And so to help us understand this, we're going to look at something in the New Testament from a guy named Paul, who was a leader in the church, who Paul wrote to Christians thousands of years ago. And the people that he wrote this particular letter to, which was the church in Rome, the people that he wrote this particular letter to were dealing with the temptation to compare themselves to other people, especially people who didn't have a faith like they did. And this was the case of Christians. They were comparing themselves to non-Christians. But what Paul says is it can really apply to different types of comparison. So Paul says this in Romans chapter 12, verse 2. He says, don't copy the behavior and the customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. You see, Paul tells them right out of the gate, don't compare or copy the people around you. And he could have stopped there. He could have just said, hey, don't copy the behaviors and the customs of this world. And he could have just been done with it. But it was definitely something they needed to hear. But this sentence, and that sentence alone, is a really good thing, to quit worrying so much about the people around them. But Paul didn't stop there. He continues on, and I think the reason is because he understood this is not going to be an easy thing to do. It's like telling a kid on Halloween, hey, don't eat too much candy. It's really difficult. And comparison is something that we all struggle with. And I think that's why Paul takes it a step deeper, because he says, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Now, Paul isn't just talking about, hey, this is a good thing to do. He's saying you need to stop comparing yourself to others and stop copying their behavior. But he takes it a step further because he's talking about a new way of thinking. He's talking about a new way of thinking. He's talking about a transformation, a major change. And that change makes you an entirely new person. It all starts with allowing God to change the way we think. And see, Paul put a tiny bit of the focus on the audience that he was writing to. He says, don't copy or compare. But he puts a lot of focus on you and a lot of focus on me because he says, let God transform you. It's a shift in focus to go from comparing yourself to them to allowing God to transform you. It's a shift in focus to go from comparing yourself to them and allowing God to transform you. Now, when you and I start to understand what God says about us and how God sees us, it has the potential to change everything. When old thinking is replaced by new thinking, it takes our focus off someone else's life and it moves us to who God created us to be. Now, we can choose to live with this mindset every single day, to live with the mindset of being intentional about the things that we think about, thanking God for the good in our lives. And that's how we break free from the cycle of comparison and the cycle of never thinking we're enough, which is the thief of everything. But I want you to think about a few key words that Paul gives us here when he kind of, switches between talking about them and talking about you. He says, but let God transform you. But let God transform you. This means you decide to let God do the transformation. You proactively determine to move in a different direction. Think of it this way. You choose to see yourself the way God does. You choose to see yourself the way God does. Now, to help you understand this, I've got a couple of visual illustrations for you today. So this cup is a representation of what it looks like when we compare ourselves to other people. And to help us really get this, I've got some coins here with me to kind of help us illustrate this, because when we focus on other people, we tend to think about things like their talents or their money, their looks, their popularity, their grades, or their humor. And we find ourselves fixating on these things. And what happens is we're left with what you can see here is some coins, kind of a small representation of that. But the reality is that when we choose to see ourselves the way God sees us, it's a different kind of measurement. Because what this means is that instead of focusing on other people's things, we start to focus on God's love for us, the worth that God assigns to us, how valuable God says we are, God's purpose for our lives, and the gifts and talents that God has given us. And suddenly what we see happening is that the things that we were measuring over here don't measure up to the things that we should be measuring on the other side. You see, it's a much more valuable place to focus when we focus on the things that God has given us and the abilities and the skills and the talents and the love that He has for us, and to carry that with us all the time. But Paul isn't done yet, because a few verses later in Romans chapter 12, verse 6, he says, so since we find ourselves fashioned into all these excellently formed and marvelously functioning parts in Christ's body, let's go ahead and be what we were made to be, without enviously or pridefully comparing ourselves with each other or trying to be something we aren't. Paul's saying, focus on who you were made to be. We're made by God, and we're made and loved by God. We were formed and created with specific gifts and talents and traits and skills that make us more than enough. And the more that we focus on that, the more that it will change our thinking and eventually change us. You see, believing this truth has the potential to break free from comparison and put that thief in lockdown. It has the power to help you change the thinking into believing that you are indeed enough. So I want to give you a couple practical ways to do this today. The first is identify what's not true. Identify what's not true. In order to really change your thinking and to start believing what's really true about you, you've got to first identify what's not. You have to ask yourself the question, what areas of my life leave me feeling like I'm not enough? Look for the places in your life that lead you to compare. And think about some of the negative things that you tend to think about yourself on a regular basis. Things like maybe I'm not attractive enough, or I'm not popular enough, or I'm not smart enough. So the first thing is to identify what's not true. The second thing is to replace old thoughts with new ones. Replace old thoughts with new ones. Identify the negative thought, and then come up with something positive or replace it. Maybe you think of things like, well, I'm a really great friend, or I'm generous, or I'm good at playing the guitar, or something else. And you can replace your thoughts with truths about who God says you are. You can say things like this: God says I am loved. I am a child of the King. God considers me to be a friend. I'm important to God. God made me with incredible gifts. Or the Spirit of God lives in me. Whatever it is, pick something that celebrates who you are and who God made you to be. And let those new, true thoughts help you break free from the cycle of comparison. Now, as we've said with a lot of these things, that may not be an easy thing to do initially. And so ask God to help you. You may have to find a place where you can write down these truths and you can say them out loud over and over again. And one day they will begin to sink in. And over time, I think you'll begin to see God opening your eyes to more amazing things about you and about who God created you to be. And you'll begin to see that in God, you're enough. And this is a much more freeing and less exhausting way to live. Imagine, instead of living with a thief, you could start living in freedom. Why? Because you choose to see yourself the way God sees you. You choose to see yourself the way God sees you. Because listen, God sees you, He sees your worth, your value, and He loves you incredibly. And so that's what we want you to do, is we want you to choose to see yourself the way God sees you. Let me pray for you. Heavenly Father, we just thank you so much for who you are, God, and for your grace and your mercy and your love. And we just pray, Jesus, that for those that have heard this message today, that you would help them with this issue of comparison, that they would start to identify the negative things that they think about themselves, and that they would look for ways to replace those negative thoughts with positive ones. Maybe it's a reflection of something of who you created them to be, or God, some of the gifts or talents or skills that you've blessed them with, or God, something that you desire for them. And so Jesus, we just pray today that you would empower them, that you would strengthen them, and God, that you would help them to see themselves the way that you see them. Jesus, we love you, we thank you, and we ask all these things in your name. Amen. Well, thanks so much for tuning in to this final week of our series, Thief of Everything, as we've been talking about the idea of comparison. If you missed the first 2 weeks, I encourage you to go back and kind of check out those, get caught up on all that stuff. We'd also love to see you in person. If maybe you missed tonight, or maybe you haven't joined us yet, we want you to know we meet on Sunday nights from 6 to 8 p.m. in the youth room at New Hope Church. We'd love to have you join us. Next week, we're going to be taking a week off, and then we're going to follow that up, kicking off a 4-week series called Thicker Than Water. And we're going to look at this idea of family and talk about the relationships that you have with your parents and your siblings, cousins, aunts, uncles, all those people, grandparents. And we're going to really unpack the fact of how that works and what that should look like and what God's really called us to do as we talk about this theme of families. So we invite you to join us 6 to 8 p.m. in the youth room on Sunday nights. We hope you've had a wonderful and great day, that we hope the rest of your week is amazing, and we really hope to see you soon. Have a wonderful day.